So Antonio Gramsci, as I said, an Italian, the founder of the Italian Communist Party, he wrote the prison notebooks, which are his version of Marxist theory or Marxist philosophy, translated into English by guess who? Translated into English by a man named Joseph Buttigieg. Joseph Buttigieg is the father of Secretary Pete Buttigieg. I kid you not. Joseph Buttigieg is the predominant person who brought Gramsci's Marxist theory here to the United States by translating Gramsci's prison notebooks from Italian into English. This is Pete Buttigieg's father. This is why, by the way, it is mind-blowing to me that in the course of Pete Buttigieg's political career, that there has not been more attention given to the fact that his father, Joseph Buttigieg, was an avowed Marxist, that his father was part of Marxist organizations, that contributed to Marxist publications, was the founder, or at least in charge of a Gramsci society. This is a pretty significant connection between a very insidious form of Marxism brought to us by Gramsci and a very powerful Democratic politician here in the United States. Joseph Buttigieg, father of Pete Buttigieg, was the primary translator of Gramsci into English. And I read this and I thought, how did I never notice this, right? How did I never notice when I've been reading Gramsci, it says on the front cover, Joseph Buttigieg, and I never looked to see who translated it. I didn't care, in a sense. And now I see, well, I certainly should have cared. It really, if you zoom out and look at this big picture, it really makes you wonder when Secretary Pete now says that this anti-groomer bill, the Parental Rights and Education Bill, which does not ban anyone from saying gay, which does prohibit classroom instruction regarding gender identity and sexual orientation in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade, and prohibits school administrators from hiding from parents when their children transition genders in the public school system. That's all it does. When Secretary Pete says that this bill, which is not a bill, it's now a law, will kill people, it really puts this into perspective. So I do want to take a moment and just say this claim from Secretary Pete is patently false. It's false for a couple of reasons. One, it's a logical fallacy to say that something must happen based on a threat of self-harm or suicide or violence from another side. You never should, especially politically, cave to a threat like that. You never should do something that's inadvisable based on a threat of suicide from someone else. So that should never be the case. Just like there's a case out of Ohio where a 16-year-old girl wanted to transition to a boy. Her parents said, you know what, you have other mental health problems. We want to get you help. And you can transition once you're 18 and you're out of our house, but we're not going to facilitate that under our roof because we think that that's not what's going to help your gender dysphoria and your comorbidities, your other diagnoses. And this girl went to court, and the court ruled in favor of her. The court ruled that the parents lost custody of the child, and the child was given to someone else who would facilitate the transgender transition. And the judge that made this ruling ruled that it was because this girl would commit suicide if she wasn't transitioned, that she had threatened to commit suicide if this transition was not facilitated. And at the time I thought to myself, I was like, so a 16-year-old girl is holding our whole society, whether it's the judge, whether it's her parents, hostage based on a threat. That is not justice. That is not rule of law. That is something that we should patently reject as a society. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's also just an inaccurate claim from Secretary Pete that this bill would harm anyone. First of all, the left tells us that indoctrination into gender identity doesn't happen at the primary school level. So how do you have that not happening? And also, if it's prohibited from happening, that it would cause people to die. Can't have it both ways. Can't have it both ways. So both of those things can't be true. It turns out, of course, that neither of those things are true. That there are teachers, both at an institutional level and an individual level, who are indoctrinating children in gender identity. But indoctrinating children in gender identity produces more people who identify as LGBTQ. And this is not my opinion. This is not my inference. You can actually look at the statistics. 20% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ compared to 10% of millennials and fewer than that in each preceding generation. So what's changed is not an environment or a culture in our country that's more open to this. What's changed is the indoctrination of this ideology into youth causes more people to identify as LGBTQ, which if you want to walk down this logical train of thought, which I think we should to respond to Secretary Pete, then if you are actively exposing children to an ideology that causes them to identify as more often as transgender, and transgender children or children with gender dysphoria who are transitioned are more likely to commit suicide, then by exposing them to the transgender ideology in the first place that leads them to identify as transgender and transition, you are actually leading children to a higher rate of suicide. So you could argue that the exposure of this ideology actually kills children. It's a hyperbolic claim, but if we want to play on the same level as Secretary Pete here, his claim is not only inaccurate, you could argue it the absolute opposite direction here.